Hello, everyone, and welcome to the panel on economic freedom and democracy in the Middle East and North Africa. My name is Dannaoui. I'm an associate director at the Freedom and Prosperity Center, and I'll be moderating this panel. Joining me today is Rabah Arezki. Rabah is a former vice president at the African Development Bank, a former chief economist at the World Bank Middle East and North Africa region, and a former chief of commodities at the IMF's research department. He's now a professor and director of research at the French National Center for Scientific Research, a senior fellow at the Foundation for Studies and Research on International Development at Harvard Kennedy School. Also joining us today is Senator Mohamed Farid. Mohamed is an Egyptian senator and deputy chair for the Committee on Human Rights and Social Solidarity, as well as a founding member of the Cairo Liberal Club. Previously, he held leadership roles in the Free Egyptian Party and the Egyptian Engineers Syndicate. Welcome.
Thank you.
And finally, joining us online is Racha Helwa. Racha is a director of Empower Me initiative at the Atlantic Council Rafik Hariri Center for the Middle East. She's a senior economist with 25 years of professional experience in economic and financial policy analysis and implementation, and has worked in the private sector, government, and academia in the US, UK, France, and Egypt. Welcome. So let's start our discussion now with our first question to Rabah. Rabah, how has democracy in the MENA region evolved over time, specifically in relation to economic freedom, and what causes differences between countries in the region?
Thank you, Nina. Thank you for having me. So the region is notorious to have suffered a democratic deficit. The situation has been fairly stagnant until the so-called Arab Spring, which the region witnessed. So it was a burst of, anguish for democracy. The people of the region were longing for democracy, for freedom. Unfortunately, we are over 10 years from the Arab Spring, and there was an important backlash following this eruption of democracy, of freedom. Protests did lead to free election, but this election did yield a backlash to autocratic rule. And as a result, we are now in this back to this more stagnant situation of freedom and prosperity. The economic situation is also quite dire, and I would say across the board in the region. Even so, one could distinguish on the economic front the performance of several Gulf countries, which I think the Atlas document very well, where there is the example of Saudi Arabia, which is launching that massive economic transformation program, is certainly one to take note of and perhaps watch for others in the region to follow. But of course, there are also important tension, conflict in the region that also may define the future of democracy and prosperity. And we've got to find solution on the security and peace front to move toward that agenda of prosperity and freedom.
Thank you, Rabah, and thank you also for contributing to our Atlas book for the chapter on MENA and chapters on Egypt and Saudi Arabia. So now moving to Egypt and to Mohamed, as we reflect on Egypt post-Arab Spring journey, how does Egypt experience compare with broader MENA trends in political and economic transitions?
Well, looking at the trend at the region, there are similarities and differences. But let me first start by what Rabah eloquently mentioned in the book. There are three different groups of the countries in the Middle East and MENA region that transferred their economy, the high-speed ones like the GCC, the moderate speed, where Egypt and most of North Africa, Lebanon and Jordan too, and finally the lower speed. Egypt is in the moderate speed, but Egypt by far the largest whether in population and in the economy. And let that sink in for a moment, because I'll get back again to it. Egypt historically struggled with achieving prosperity and freedom. It has been, as long as the data covers, been mostly unfree, mostly unprosperous. In the past 10 years, Egypt faced a compounded challenges. I presume it was unprecedented to have all this amount of challenges, in the same time, in the same period, starting from 2 revolutionary waves, moving toward a war and terror in Sinai. Adding to that, massive regional instability, whether there was on every single border of Egypt, there is a civil war or an instability even on the maritime borders. Russian invasion to Ukraine, repercussion of that, disruption in the supply chains, and unfavorable macroeconomic environment globally, where there is monetary tightening. These have its toll on the Egyptian economy and its pursuit on freedom and prosperity, but it's not the root cause. The root cause, in my opinion, that Egypt economy is a state-led economy. It's not a market-led economy. And to be honest with you, this economic model, characterized with heavy state intervention, created structural deformation, limiting economic freedom, contracting the private sector, crowding it out, creating more distortions in the economy, making it more dependent on either non-tradable sectors like real estate, construction, infrastructure, or vulnerable to external shock, vulnerable sectors to external shocks like Suez Canal revenues, tourism, and remittance. Yet, this commitment to state-driven economy was always been thought of as a reason for stability. I mean, among many of decision makers and even politicians, they think that if the state can provide the jobs, can create jobs, provide services, goods, this will create stability. And after the Arab Spring, this rationale had been renewed because many thought that the revolution broke out due to the resentment of the youth against Mubarak and his elites who were business people. Surprisingly, this, in an ominous way, resonates with what Hayek once said, that whoever controls means must decide which ends and they are to serve. And under modern conditions, control of economic activity means control of material means of particularly all our ends. It means control over nearly all our activities. Of course, Hayek meant total another thing that what actually happened. But having said that, I still have some optimism. Back again to the point that I was mentioned early, that Egypt by far the largest economy in this group, this opportunity to use the current challenges as a way to channel more reforms. For example, right now, while we're talking, there is the second phase of a national dialogue specialized on economy that had been launched a year ago. I personally actively engaged in that, and many other different political players from the entire political spectrum. Yesterday, probably for the first time, we see a real action from the government regarding privatizing the management of airports, and for that it used to be a taboo, a no-no, a big no-no. So we shouldn't waste a good crisis, and there might be a silver lining in this crisis to push for reforms. It still has to be patient. You have to be patient, and it has to be accumulated, one step at a time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And now moving to Racha. Racha, how are MENA countries progressing in meeting the Sustainable Development Goals and the 23 Agenda?
Thank you, Nina. A very timely discussion, given that the 2030 Agenda has been almost forgotten globally, and the MENA region is not exception to that. So in general, the Middle East and North Africa region doesn't score highly in terms of achieving the SDGs. The average score is about 58 out of 100, 1 being the lowest, 100 being the highest. That's the average. Yet there are positive trends in 3 key areas, at least in the region. Education is one, SDG 4, affordable and clean energy, SDG 7, and climate action, SDG 13. Despite this progress, however, there are different challenges that persist, particularly regarding gender equality. That's SDG number 5, poverty and hunger, SDGs 1 and 2, health and well-being, SDG 3, clean water and sanitation, industry and infrastructure, peace, justice, and strong institutions, which is SDG number 16. Now, if we look at each country separately, the 6 best performing countries in the region in terms of achieving the SDGs to a large extent are Tunisia, Morocco, Algeria, Jordan, the UAE, and Egypt. On the other hand, Syria, Libya, and Yemen are the least performing in terms of SDG attainment because overall poor and conflict-affected nations face substantial challenges across at least 10 out of the 17 SDGs. And coming back to what has been discussed by others, including Mohamed just before me, it's worth noting also that the recent exogenous shocks, including the pandemic crisis, Ukraine-Russia conflict, the recent Israel-Gaza war, have strained the region's economies, diverting public resources that could have been invested in social sectors like healthcare and education to rather respond to these crises, the impact of those in terms of inflation, etc. So many countries in the region are basically still struggling to overcome the social and economic impact of these shocks. So, you know, the hope is the region has already hosted 2 COPs recently, which really helped raise momentum and awareness about the impact of climate change in the region, and really hoping to be able to revive the discussion around the other 16 SDGs in order to meet the goals of the 2030 agenda.
Thank you, Racha. And now moving back to you, Rabah, and question about cooperation. So how can regional cooperation and integration initiative enhance economic resilience and prosperity in the MENA region?
Thank you, Nina. So the region is one of the least integrated in the world. And to understand that, my theory, which is very much akin to what the senator just mentioned, is the presence of the state in the economy at the domestic level reverberate in bilateral relationship. If you have politicized, if you wish, the domestic economy, when you try and invest in a neighbor, the neighbor very much looks at the potential investment from a private entity as potentially a state investment. And as a result, I think we got to that low equilibrium where integration is very low. So I think the solution, to more integration should be in trying to roll back the role of the state in the economy, so as to let this fairly large region flourish through more cross-border and trade. I think that's important. I also want to draw your attention on a trend which we see happening with the special economic zone that are flourishing in the region, and notably between Saudis and UAE. The flourishing of these special economic zones are very much an ambition to try and take advantage of the wonders of the global economy, yet it is potentially fragmenting common markets. Indeed, the rivalry between UAE and Saudi is very much at play. So the region has to try and come together while trying to be very much open to the rest of the world. So I think what we see at play in the region is also happening in other parts of the world. So while we think that new geopolitics is going to bring about more regional blocks, within this bloc we see this tension and rivalry operating between different actors. So we've got to also think through how this special economic zone, which are fragmenting common frameworks, if you wish, across the region, have to be squared. Otherwise, we will end up in more rivalry, which is somewhat healthy, but which make the region lose the opportunity to integrate amongst each other.
Thank you, Rabah. And maybe we keep the same topic and shift to Egypt. Mohamed, how can Egypt leverage its strategic position to lead regional cooperation efforts and for shared prosperity in the region?
Well, it's funny enough that this region, the MENA region, historically have been in the center of economic integration and in the center of free trade by the time. And yet there is also a lot of legal framework that bilateral trade agreements or multilateral trade agreements, but with a very little or almost none impact on the ground. For example, looking at the energy, which is really important sector, only 2% of electricity produced in MENA region is traded between the countries, despite there is a lot of interconnectivity between the different grids. Projects focused on electrical interconnectivity, infrastructure development, underscore potential for greater economic independence and collaboration. There are some success stories in that field, Egypt led through, like the qualified industrial zones, the QIZ, between Egypt, Jordan, Israel, and the United States. It helped creating a lot of prosperity for the people and stabilized and ensured peace between these countries. Adding to that, the Mediterranean Gas Forum, the East Mediterranean Gas Forum, and this showcase also ability to forge beneficial economic partnerships. These initiatives could possibly help, do more integration. Moreover, the involvement of Egypt in the Negev Forum presents further opportunities for integration and cooperation. This platform for dialogue among countries who had signed the Abrahamic Accord and signed peace treaties with Israel can be a foundation to build more of economic and multilateral integration and trade. By promoting policies encouraging economic integration, we can mitigate the conflict, enhance stability, and create prosperous region and collaborative frameworks. And we have already success stories. We need to either invest more into it or to replicate it to a wider scope.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mohamed. Now back to you, Racha. How do poverty and inequality impact economic development in the middle-income MENA countries, such as Egypt, Jordan, Tunisia, and Morocco?
Thank you, Nina. So I always like to use numbers just to give an indication of the extent of the problem. And the MENA region is one of the most unequal regions worldwide in terms of both income and gender inequalities. So on income, 60% of the region's wealth is possessed by only 10% of the population. And income inequality can actually be witnessed in two ways, between countries within the region. So there is a significant gap, for example, between the oil exporting countries and the oil importing countries, and within the same country. So, for example, in the case of Egypt and Morocco, there are significant income inequalities between rural and urban households. At the same time, the region is also one of the slowest in the world to show progress on gender equality. And this has been shown in multiple indicators, including education, healthcare, and labor markets. So how is this really impactful? And as a result, women's participation in the labor force is very compromised in many countries. So, for example, the labor force participation by female averages at 15% in Egypt, well below the mean. 20%, actually 15% also in Jordan, 21% in Morocco, 26% in Tunisia, 28% in Lebanon. This is definitely low, and if you want to think about it in terms of opportunity cost, you can think about it as missing out on up to 35% of the contribution towards GDP, because these females could have been in the market if they had access to skills and to labor force.
Thank you, Racha. Okay, back to you, Rabah, and maybe we can talk a bit about media freedom. What role does media freedom play in fostering democratic governance and accountability in MENA region, and what are challenges to ensuring a free media landscape?
Yeah. So this is one of the most worrisome trend, I must say, in the region. The number of journalists killed, jailed, is staggering, and of course it participates of a global trend where we see regression in freedom of the press, and as well as other freedom, and unfortunately this is a sad example where we by encouraging more freedom we could get more support for prosperity. And the channel I see is very much that while, as the senator just mentioned earlier, this was a region which culture was very much rooted in trade, has now fallen back in terms of its support for markets. And media freedom, as well as think tanks such as the Council here, do not have a say in the region. There's very limited freedom. It's not true across the board, but we see regression on that freedom across the board in the region. And if the region keeps on limiting that press freedom, the freedom of think tank to operate, to analyze data, which at times have also been scarce in the region, we'll see more regression on the support for market and therefore for reform, and more for even more state presence, and that would be very unfortunate for prosperity as well as obviously for freedom.
Thank you, Rabah. And now back to you, Mohamed, and maybe we can talk a bit about youth. How can Egypt empower its young generation to drive political participation and promote democratic values?
Well, Egypt is an ancient country, but surprisingly, a very young nation. The percentage of young people aging from 18 and 29, and 18 is the age of voting, are 22% of the population. There are around 3.5 million young Egyptians enrolled in higher education. So the Egyptian youth also shown their potential as a driver for change, whether in the Arab Spring and the following events for that. But for over half a century in Egypt, there was a significant gap in genuine interest and opportunity for young people for political participation. This led them either to apathy or radicalization. And of course, we see the impact of these apathy or radicalization happening after that. After the revolution, there was a shifting happening. For example, a number of the members of the parliament, and we have two chambers, but I'm talking about the House of Representatives. In 2010, just right before the revolution, the percentage of members of the parliament under 35, they were 8%. The year after, in 2012, when the first election after the revolution, it was 11%. Last election, 2020, it went up to 21%. So there is a shifting happening. It takes time. Yeah, it's a decade, but let's look at it again. It's just 2 parliamentary terms. So there is still hope, and there is an opportunity. Other than that, there were some initiatives for empowering young people. There was a presidential initiative called the Presidential Leadership Program, and it materialized out by seeing a significant number of young politicians holding executive offices, whether deputy ministers or deputy governors. This used to be perceived as a taboo before that. Now we see this, it's a little bit of change, but it's not enough. We are 105 million or 110 now probably, and increasing while we talk, population. So it's even that it's not enough. It needs to be more systematic. If we listen, if we learn the lesson from the work of this of the Center of Freedom and Prosperity, it means the lesson is that democracy and freedom and prosperity are interrelated, and we need to remove the barriers. Removing the barriers, meaning to allow more participation for younger people, especially young women, in the market and in the political field. Adding to that also the freedom of organization and the freedom of expression. These are important tools, because by the end of the day, if you'd like the people to actively engage in politics, they need to be able to have the opportunity to express themselves freely, and even for the candidates to be able to put forward platforms. Plus that, of course, the freedom of information, so they can design policies and platforms that can appeal to the voters. So simply, we need more economic freedom, and also political freedom goes hand to hand. Then we can create prosperity for the future.
Yeah, thank you, Mohamed. Now, Racha, let's talk a bit about the climate. And the MENA region is among the most vulnerable to climate change globally. What are the expected economic and social implications of climate change in MENA?
Thank you, Nina. Time question, given that we just came back from COP 28 in Dubai. In fact, much of the region is located in geographically unfavorable climate zones and subject to warming, desertification, water stress, and rising sea levels. So this inevitably leads to fundamental economic disruptions, threatens food security because of agricultural disruptions, for example, and undermines public health conditions with negative implications on poverty and equality, which we just discussed. The consequences of climate change are also expected to increase migration, elevate the risk of conflict in an already turbulent environment within MENA. And in terms of which countries that are going to be affected, which sectors that are going to be affected more, the IMF has defined resilience to climate change based on a few indicators, including economic growth and macroeconomic stability, socioeconomic strength, infrastructure and investment capabilities, and institutional efficiency. So based on that, as expected, low and middle-income countries and conflict-affected economies in the region are going to be the most impacted, provided also the absence of fiscal space to finance and promote pro-climate policies. At the same time, some oil exporting MENA economies are also going to be severely affected by changes in climate. I can think of Kuwait, for example, which is the second most affected country in the region in terms of increase in temperatures. And so how can we quantify this in terms of economic loss or gain? So far, the research has demonstrated that extreme climate conditions, such as higher temperatures, can significantly alter growth. And in a recent World Bank IMF study, it has been estimated that every MENA country where temperature levels are around 26 degrees or more are going to lose on GDP with every 1 degree Celsius extra increase in temperature. So this is actually quite alarming. And some sectors are going to be mostly affected because they have external exposure with workers going under extreme conditions, and this includes agriculture, construction, and tourism, which are actually vitals for many economies in this region, including the middle-income countries, but also many countries of the Gulf. At the same time, I always like to think of climate change as an opportunity. So if we look at the other side of the coin, this risk could also be perceived as a great catalyst for the transition towards a greener economy in the region, since the potential for renewable energy generation is also huge. Between solar and wind energy, the entire MENA region is expected to be hub for at least 60% of the renewable energy resources worldwide. And that's basically why many governments in the region started to implement sort of the energy transition plans, whether in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, or Morocco, to increase their renewable component in the energy mix over the coming years. And investments in the renewable sectors are worth billions. So I honestly like to think of this as a risk, but also a great opportunity for the economies of the region.
Thank you, Racha. Next question goes to you, Mohamed, in the context of Israel-Hamas conflict. What potential pathways could be pursued to achieve a sustainable resolution to this conflict, ensuring greater stability and prosperity in the region?
Well, Hamas must be defeated. This is before any further discussion. It must be defeated. But while defeating Hamas, we have to make sure that no civilians be in harm's way. Right now, Egypt is actively engaged in delivering humanitarian aid. Earlier today, there was an airdrop of humanitarian aid over Gaza. Also, on the other hand, involved in the mediation and negotiation to release the innocent hostages that were being abducted by Hamas in the terror act of October 7. So in order to create this stability and prosperity, I believe we need to take some steps. The first step, of course, as I mentioned, is defeating Hamas. We have to work on reaching an immediate and fast cease of hostilities so we can release the hostages and ensure sufficient aid going to the displaced innocent people there. Adding to that, addressing the influence of Hamas and other Islamic terrorist groups, in this sector, and make sure that cut their influence. And because since they took over the Gaza Strip in 2007, they brought nothing but misery and pain for the Palestinian people and even for the neighboring country. Hamas-affiliated fighters have been infiltrated the borders to Sinai and fought with the Islamic terrorist groups during the war on terror in Egypt. So. They brought nothing but misery for their own people and for other countries, and they are using them as cannon fodders and human shields. Next to that, empowering the Palestinians to lead a peace process and ensure the solution fair and sustainable and comes from the Palestinians, not any other external forces that impose whatever they think. Finally, ensuring access to basic necessities like water, energy, with support of neighboring countries. Egypt and UAE is supplying Gaza now with potable water via pipelines throughout Arish, where and installed desalination factories there. These need to be stabilized, and need to be sustainable, not just a makeshift thing that like what's happening now. Let's not forget that one of the problems with Gaza, that they lack any independence when it comes to utilities, water and electricity. And in the beginning of the war, it was cut off, and this make the human tragedy further. Adding to that, post-conflict, we must focus on reconstruction and the economic development, and this approach aimed to improve the living conditions of the Palestinians and creating opportunities. And this goes through a regional partnership, integrating regional partnership. Like, for example, what's happening now for delivering the aid could be a foundation to build upon further model, when it comes to reconstruction, to creating opportunities, and we must make sure also to prevent the other forces of evil, for lack of better word, to intervene in this process, because we don't like to grow again the extremists. Finally, we need to make a shift in the state of Gaza economy. Gaza for decades now being reliant only on foreign aid and charity, which was stolen by Hamas and other groups, and enriching themselves, and preventing the people. But you cannot let 2.5 million people just living on charity and aid. There must be a sustainable economic model and creating prosperity for them and widening the participation. So if we go through these steps, step by step, these 5 or 6 steps, I believe that we can create prosperity and we can also achieve the integration in the region, and it would be a very good example for what peace can achieve, what freedom can do, and achieving prosperity. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohamed. In the same context, Rabah, how can we overcome the persistent hindrance to democracy and progress caused by regional conflicts in the region and continue advancing?
Thank you, Nina. So, so a bit of context, building on what the senator just mentioned. The region is indeed one that had a fair share of conflict, no doubt. But before October 7, clearly, there was a view, including from the Biden administration, that this was a trend of de-escalation. And indeed, we saw the Abraham Accord normalizing with from select Arab countries with Israel. We also saw a detente between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So all was going well and good until October 7, where we had that shock. The good news is in that very dark picture is that the Saudi Arabia detente is still holding. But indeed, I second what the senator just mentioned. We need to come to this escalation, which risks engulfing the whole region, needs to come to an end. We have Ramadan coming. I think this is an opportunity to really bring all the forces, of goodwill, Arab country, the Biden administration, and others to really rush to get that ceasefire, release the hostages, of course, as well. And I think that's the first step. The discussion about two-state solution appear from the perspective of the region as a mirage. So discussion of potential two-state solution are not just premature, but they are really not helping deliver the steps, getting that aid through, solving the humanitarian crisis. So, and we need, I agree on Hamas, but we also need an Israeli administration that is willing to be a partner in peace. And at the moment, the Netanyahu administration is clearly not committed to that. So I think there's step by step, and the ceasefire and the release of the hostage before Ramadan would really be a great first steps.
Thank you, Rabah. I see we have about 8 minutes left, so we want to make sure we take some questions from the audience. There's one for you, Racha. What innovative policies can MENA countries implement to dismantle barriers faced by women in accessing economic freedom and opportunities?
Sure, thank you, Nina. So we touched briefly on gender inequality, how significant it is in the region. It actually varies between the middle-income countries towards the oil exporting countries. So in the oil exporting countries, we're talking about close to 50% participation, which is pretty high. While in middle-income countries, it actually slows down. So on average, based on World Bank data, only 20% of women overall in MENA over the age of 15 are able to participate in the workforce. With these variations, I'm thinking of the leading countries in terms of female participation. We're thinking of Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, and the UAE. On the lowest end, there are Algeria, Jordan, Egypt, and Morocco. So overall, between the two groups, the challenges are more or less the same. Challenges facing women in the labor market include low or mismatched education and skills, challenging legal environment in terms of family law, in terms of labor law, also provided the absence of labor law protection mechanisms for women. Absent of support structures for working mothers and expensive childcare services. This is a big barrier. So at some point, women have to choose between family and work. Absence of support, uneven transition also to the digital economy. Not all women have the same access to technology or to learning technology. and also uneven access to finance for women, for female entrepreneurs, in addition to the persistent socioeconomic skeptical perception of the abilities and capability of women and the marketplace in general. So fundamentally, enabling women to participate in the workforce starts with institutional and legal reforms to ensure that family law and labor law, they both treat women equally to men and provide equal labor protection rights in the workplace. In addition to that, improving access to quality education is essential, of course, especially that empirical data actually shows that women who have been through tertiary education in MENA have a higher participation rate in the labor force than women with intermediate education. Other targeted incentives that could similarly be considered would include, for example, tax-funded maternity leave and subsidized childcare services. But I think the starting point is really the legal framework. And I guess, like with multiple efforts now at the grassroots level, there is a lot of change that we can see in terms of how the society perceives the role of women and responsibilities in general, including in the Gulf region.
Thank you, Racha. A question to you, Rabah. How do informal economies affect the overall economic landscape in MENA region, and what policies can be implemented to formalize these sectors?
Let me push back on the informality, the depiction of the informality as necessarily bad. To me, the informal sector in the region is normal. In many respects is a reaction to the excessive presence of the state and potential cronies. And in a sense, the informal sector is the most contestable market in the economy because it has low barrier to entry, a low barrier to exit. So in a sense, the informal is normal and should not be combated, if you wish, as necessarily a bad thing, but rather a more reflection of what the economy is truly, given the distortion, given the overwhelming presence of the state and other crony firms. So in many respects, the rest of the economy has to be more open, and we've got to remove the barrier to entry, access to markets for these informal enterprise to grow. And there are in addition to these steps of bringing more freedom to economic freedom and removing the barrier, granting them more access to market. Of course, there are issues of productivity as well that are essential. Telecom, digitalization is also a very important step for them to help them grow, in addition to granting them access to the market on a fair and equal basis.
Thank you, Rabah. I believe we have time for one question for Mohamed about digital technology, actually. So how can Egypt use digital technologies to boost its economy and create more opportunity for its people?
Well, with significant number of young Egyptian people, whether in school or in higher education, this is a pivotal moment to leverage digital technologies to transform the future. Digital transformation gives a substantial opportunity for democratization of market access. It helps increasing the market participation, access also to education, financial service, enabling wider segments of the population, especially those who are vulnerable and marginalized, talking about women, for example, and younger people. Adding to that, it helps in reducing the cost of doing business, and it also helps in when it comes to formalization, to the formality. What really matters for me is giving those people the opportunity to thrive and grow. The predominant conditions of informality doesn't necessarily always help with that. So with digital transformation can resolve this problem. Also, this will help simplifying and streamlining the bureaucratic process and finally, the beauty of the digitalization, it's much less, I don't like to use a harsh word or the word, pardon my English, but it's much less deeply or heavily regulated than the regular economy, where you have a lot of barriers there, and this gives you a better opportunity, for thriving, and especially for those who live in rural areas or in vulnerable situation, and again, women and younger people.
Thank you so much, Mohamed. And this actually concludes our panel discussion for today. Thank you so much for the panelists, for your participation and the insights and the great information you shared with us. Thank you for everyone for attending this panel and for everyone who tuned in. Please stay tuned. There's another panel on Africa that's coming up in a few minutes, so please don't go anywhere. Thank you. Thank you.